Welcome back to another episode of the podcast doing by a software engineer. I'm your host, Perry, and today we got Abhay on the show. Abhay, how are you?
Doing good. Excited to be here and to help you be another software engineer who's going to run your podcast with you. So excited.
Yeah, I honestly do appreciate it because I think this sentiment, at least in the industry, that we try. I mean, we do serious work at the end of the day, right? But we kind of take it lightly as well, and we're able to pick on our own mistakes and our own flaws and really just work with it. So yeah, ruined by many engineers today, and honestly, I keep on saying it, but it's absolutely my pleasure, our pleasure listening to you because I know you have a very interesting background, and especially the stuff that you work on today. Absolutely fascinating. But I guess for the people that don't know you yet, you want to give us a quick intro of who are you and what you've been up to lately?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Abhay. I'm a software engineer. I work at this company called Anduril Industries, which is sort of a defense startup focused on autonomous systems and AI for defense, and lots of robotics, lots of perception, lots of machine learning, lots of sensor integration and platformy work. So that has been my focus for the last couple of years or so. Before that, I was in college. I was doing AI research, focusing on machine learning, computer vision, and I also worked at Facebook and Stanford on related areas.
Yeah, I mean, that was a mouthful, but that's why, when you hear about this kind of stuff, it gets so exciting because the topic that we could dive into in terms of people take it for granted that AI, ML, they're all integrated into our day-to-day life, but being able to actually look at it daily and even building any kind of infrastructure around it, I think that's going to be relevant for, many people listening, but even for the people that, like me, don't have exact experience in it directly, whether it's that industry or whether it's, just the good practices of working in tech nowadays, or even in startups nowadays, we're definitely going to get into that. I just want to put it out there that Anduril recently had a funding round, haven't you? Big congrats on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was, I can't remember the letters anymore, but it was certainly a big jump up for us. And yeah, we've been consistently growing, doubling in valuation and so forth. So it's been pretty exciting working here through its hyper growth phase. I was employee number 47, and now we are more than 500 employees. We've also gone through an acquisition, so it's been quite the wild ride.
Yeah, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. What we could do is, what I like to do personally is, how did you get there? How did you get to where you are today? I think this is generally the most relatable part in terms of anybody's life experience is that, if you look from a third person point of view of where you are today, you kind of realize that, oh my God, a lot has happened and a lot will continue to happen. Obviously, the journey never ends. But where we could start actually is in terms of influences and passions in life. That's usually that's the core behind a lot of people at the end of the day. That's a lot of behind their drive, behind their excitement in life. I guess, where are you from? Where you grew up? What's the context here?
My sort of main passions have always been software and startups. And a couple of thinkers or people were formative in my, as I was a young student, studying computer science, I read sort of Mark Andreessen's essay on why software is eating the world, and that sort of basically, cemented this whole notion of software as being the most important thing in the next decade or century. And that was on the more software side. And the other passion I've always had is a passion for startups. And that was sort of inspired by Paul Graham, who is the founder of Y Combinator, and his essay on how to make wealth was really formative in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, definitely prominent names. When you mentioned Anderson and Paul Graham, obviously, Paul Graham big on Twitter when he talks about any kind of topic. Being able to actually expose to these kind of resources out there, that's already fantastic. Because I know personally, at least, I haven't really heard about these names well later in my life. How did you come across that, I guess? In terms of what I mean by that is that have you always grew up in a very techie, I guess, family or techie influences? Have you always been exposed your dad would have pull up a website and you'll be looking at it? What did that look like?
Yeah, I guess my experience, my personal life, I like to say that I grew up on the internet. So there was this meme at some point where everybody's posting photos of video games, like World of Warcraft or all these kinds of online role-playing games. And it's sort of, that was really formative in my upbringing. So I've always lived on the internet, and the internet has shaped my worldview, my experiences. I consumed global, information channels like TV, movies, and so forth. And all of these sort of basically, that sort of always told me that, tech is really important. And since it was such a core part of my life already, I knew that I wanted to do, or I would be interested in some of like this kind of area.
I love that you mentioned when there's games out there, because like, yes, games even back then, like people saw it in a very negative light. Even today you have the bad connotation of games, but at least when you mention that, you know, the stuff you learn, whatever the memes on World of Warcraft. For me, I actually learned English through playing Maple Story. So Maple Story is a, you know, game way back then. And because I grew up in Montreal, Canada. So for me, at least, like my main languages, my parents spoke Cantonese at home. They don't, or they barely speak any English or French. And I grew up in a French elementary school and high school. So English was like a third thing, like this mysterious bit that came in. And as you play online video games, I think that was a straight benefit. You end up like just knowing how to write English better, hear English better at the end of the day. So, did you grow up in the States then? Like, what was that story like?
But yeah, in terms of what you said about video games and so forth, I completely agree. So my own experience was with, like I mentioned already, World of Warcraft, where you would meet like people from all around the world. They were not necessarily just from one place, and you would just interact with so many people and learn about all their, you know, cultural backgrounds, and certainly it would sharpen up your, you know, English and other you know, cultural skills. So I would say that was, you know, my main primary influence.
One thing I do actually like asking is, it's already good to hear about your context in terms of this love, this passion for technology, this drive that you already had from young age, and it just keeps on going. And then there are people that discover it much later in terms of like, by the time you make a decision in whether high school or university, that's kind of where people realize that like, oh, wait, I got to make a choice here. I got to go into either finance, I got to go into psychology, I got to go into blah, blah, blah. Like, how did your decision process make? At what point in your life did you say, at least on the educational and academic side of it, at what point did you get into like a proper tech program, if you have actually?
Yeah. So I think initially my whole passion was not necessarily tech, but it was more startups. Like I mentioned, Mark Henderson, Paul Graham, and so forth. I'd been reading them. I can't even remember when I started reading them. It was in high school already. And even in high school, I was already engaged in various smaller entrepreneurial projects, like working on a non-for-profit and things like that. So I was always interested in entrepreneurship. It came very naturally to me. I was even as a child, I was sort of leading the various communities around me. So that was always a part of my life. In terms of picking software specifically, it was that was certainly more in college, where I started off in product management, and that was sort of maybe more on the business side. But over time, that sort of drew me to, okay, product management is interesting. It's about building startups, building the product. One of the elements of product management is sort of user experience, user interaction. And that was like a good overlap between, that was a good entry point for me to getting into CS through this field of human-computer interaction. And that was like my initial foray into software specifically.
Wow, yeah. I mean, it sounds already relatable in terms of like, okay, well, if we dive into the bit where you're saying like very startup / entrepreneur oriented, like that's fun to hear, because not many people are able to, you know, realize that that's something that could guide them through life, at least. I guess from the contrast is that some people, like, for example, I knew I played with computers like throughout my kid and whole life, like throughout my childhood and everything. And that was like, it wasn't a realization where it's like, oh yeah, I want to make this into my own business and like tackle the whole thing. It was more like, hey, look, it's cool to build this website. It's cool to do that. So even though we do touch a lot of the very same thing, it's so good to hear somebody being like, oh yeah, you could do this. You could make this to help this out and build the pieces together. And that's obviously a combination of project management, engineering, like those kind of come together at the end of the day. So I kind of want to hear the process of getting into a proper, I guess you said you did ComSci at the end of the day. How does one get into it? So when you were mentioning that you kind of made a jump, right? That's kind of like a leap that, you know, a lot of people want to get into. What was the story of, what did you prepare? Who did you contact? Like, how did you get from where you were into a university? I guess in the United States. Which university was it at?
I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's it's in the Midwest, and it's one of the top 20 or top 10 computer science programs in the United States.
Yeah, that's amazing. So yeah, how did that process start? Because I know my process of getting into computer science was a little bit jarring. Well, I didn't start in computer science. I started in health and physiology and math, and then I swapped into computer science. What was yours? What was your perspective at that time?
To be honest, I was just taking classes. I was exploring things. I was in this entrepreneurial residential learning community. So I was around people who are interested in entrepreneurship, interested in various areas. And it was pretty obvious pretty quickly that the most impactful entrepreneurial projects you could work on is going to be in software. And that was that basically drew me to taking some computer science classes and getting a feel for it. And once I did that, I knew I had a strong knack for it. I did well in my classes, and I was like pretty much at the top relative to everybody else around me. So that was pretty motivational in terms of, okay, this is like a place where I can excel. It will help me with my broader goals of being in startups or working at startups or starting my own startups. So it was a pretty natural choice from that perspective, and I was getting started.
Yeah, that's so cool to hear. And was it hard, I guess? I mean, given that you have already a really good background at that point of like, having a good, at least academic record. I can't speak for that for myself. For the application process, was it hard? Because I think it was like an overseas application. Like in terms of communication wise, was it all through email, through online? How did that system look like?
Yeah, all of that was pretty straightforward. I mean, you just take the standardized exams. I did decently on this SATs and so forth. So once you do that, it's not a big deal. Just fill out the applications and so forth. So that part was easy, I guess. I would say it's not the most inaccessible if you have a strong math, computer science background. If you don't, then obviously it's a little bit more challenging than it would be otherwise.
I mean, that's why I like hearing about this, that like everybody has their own story and their own approach of doing it. And since you've done it successfully, it's always good to just hear it from your point of view in that case. So thanks for that. And in terms of like the lifestyle, I guess that was a jump, right? That's when you actually like after getting accepted, congratulations on that. That was the point where you have to get on a plane and then just live your life in the States for a bit. Is that what happened then?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was not that much of a jump for me. Like I said, I kind of grew up on the internet, and in terms of culturally and so forth, it was fairly straightforward. I had a strong English background since pretty much I was born. So I spoke English at home as well. So that was kind of my first language to begin with. And yeah, once I jumped in, it was not that straightforward. It was pretty straightforward. I was able to build a strong community, social network. I was involved in clubs since day one almost. I was running clubs. I was executive member in a bunch of them, and yeah, it was pretty smooth sailing.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you really got to embrace the whole experience of like joining different clubs and everything. Unfortunately, I kind of took it for granted. I didn't do that many clubs myself, so sorry for that. One thing that I actually love to hear about is when we talk about top 10 computer science schools and all that kind of fun stuff, in terms of the topics itself. So at least I went to McGill University and I did a comp sci there, and the topics that we dove into, like very, very, I guess, Java heavy. So, but not, well, I guess that's a language that we use. But in terms of like topics, we had a lot of algorithm classes. We had a lot of like operating system classes, database classes, and then, and then we have the year-long project at the end. What were, I guess, the different topics that you covered in your university? Like, for example, like if we start with the question like, oh, what language did most of it come in?
It's probably funny that you mentioned that you use Java, because I'm pretty sure Oracle did this at some point where they they literally paid universities or did some sort of marketing scheme where they were able to establish Java as the standard for teaching across pretty much every university. And yeah, I imagine for the same reason we ended up using Java as our main language. And it was always kind of weird because it didn't necessarily have the best tooling. Maybe Python would have been a lot easier to understand or pick up as your first programming language. But yeah, I mean, that was basically the standard, and we would use it even in classes like artificial intelligence, which was peculiar. But hey, I mean, it's a decent language and it's used in many different contexts. So yeah, it was not the worst, I guess.
Nobody has ever pointed this out to me that it was definitely a maybe lobbying effort from Oracle to have the Java in everybody's hand during university. That is interesting, and like I'm so glad that you brought that up. The amount of people who are suffering from using Eclipse and Java, like please.
Yes, Eclipse. Man, I mean that was just the worst. I mean, it was just like you're coding for the first time, and then they throw you at this crazy IDE with all these buttons that you have no idea what they do. It's just it's pretty overwhelming.
Oh, yeah. I mean, okay, fine. I'm not going to get into it because there's going to be more bad memories as we go. But I'm not saying that Java was 100% of everything we use. I think you're in university, you do get exposed to, like, we did a bit of PHP, like C, Python, those are all like very common stuff that you would find in comp sci programs. And I'm guessing that for yours it was kind of similar, right? Most of it is Java, but you also got exposed to different stuff like web technologies or, different classes that you wouldn't expect to be exposed to.
Yeah, I guess the classes were pretty standard. So I did take the core classes you would take, data structures, machine organization. I took algorithms at Stanford while I was doing research there. So that was a fun experience. And otherwise at Wisconsin, I took most of the basic classes. But I also took a lot of graduate courses towards the end of my time there because I was interested in graduate work. I was doing research actively. So yeah, and it was a great opportunity to just get involved in advanced computer science.
Yeah, I definitely do want to get into the research bit, especially like having the opportunity to be a research assistant, because you do hear that when you're in university. That's a very prominent thing. So I guess for the people that are less familiar, such as me, what is a research assistant and how do you become one?
Research assistant essentially, it's these universities are research institutions. Like there's certainly an undergraduate component of it where it's a lot of teaching, but the professor's primary job when you're attending a school like the University of Wisconsin or any major research school, the professor's main job is research, not teaching. So that's a big part of the university, and in terms of funding, in terms of the structure of how they operate. And University of Wisconsin was no different in this way. So all the professors, their main job was actually research, and and the research assistant helps them with their research, as the name suggests.
That totally makes sense. And I guess what do you need to qualify as a research assistant? I'm assuming not everybody could become one, or else they'll have like 700 research assistant every semester.
It depends on what you're interested in, I guess. Certainly, if you're interested in research or in the topics the professors work, it's a great way to get more exposure in that area. In terms of qualifications, it's not that crazy, I would say. It depends on the professor again. So my first research assistantship was in the HCI department, and it was focused on building like front-end stuff for one of the robotics systems they had. So it's building this collaborative task authoring environment where you can create tasks for a robot, and then it's a industrial robot that does various kinds of tasks like picking and placing objects and so forth. So that was my first experience in being a research assistant, and my background there was I'd just done basic web development stuff using technologies like Angular, JavaScript, and so forth.
Yeah, you make it sound so casual and easy. I'm so jealous of how you make it sound that it's so capable, because that's one of the things that a lot of people are afraid of with at least the tech world's out. Like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do any of this. But the way you kind of frame it and the mindset of, yeah, there are tools out there like Angular, React, whatever JavaScript framework you want to use out there to actually build stuff. Like, they are out there. Did you have to learn that yourself, or was that part of the curriculum while you're doing there? Because I do know that sometimes it's a hard mismatch, or even the timing is hard, that you're a research assistant, but do you know how to build front-end stuff like while doing it? Like, how did that actually work out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that was definitely self-taught. So I was doing a lot of side projects. I was building a website to help out one of my friends for her university in terms of like she wanted a housing management system for a university, and there were students, they needed a place to stay, and the university did not necessarily provide a website. So I basically helped out with a website, and through that process, I learned how to build a website using all these web technologies, and it was pretty much self-driven. And then the other piece I would also say is that I had one of my good friends was already working in this research lab, so he knew me and he knew I had all the skills. So he also helped me get a foot in the door.
It's so good that when we look back, you see how these like different pieces like somehow just ended up working together, and like next thing you know, like that just obviously left a really good impact from what you do today, obviously, and what happened back then. So at least one of the better lessons that I keep on hearing and telling at the end of the day is that yes, you could be in a very tech intense university program, but there's a lot of stuff that if you do on your own, on your spare time to learn and, push whatever knowledge that you have, that has such a big impact in terms of the different opportunities that you have. So same thing for me. Like, I think a lot of the web technologies, I learned that like on my own. And then I think essentially that's basically what got me like a full-time job. So shout out to Meteor.js. I don't know anybody who still uses that or anything, but that was a really impactful one for my life. Even though people rip on it all the time, it made its mark. um, I want to ask about this Stanford experience within your University of Wisconsin experience. I know that is interesting in terms of like, was that intentional? Was that accidental? Was still a research assistant like idea behind it? Like, what happened there?
It's funny that you mentioned, and certainly like when we're going back, it's interesting to observe all this in hindsight, but certainly there's a path to dependence to all of this where if this friend of mine had never, referred me to this job in the research department in Wisconsin, I wouldn't have gotten the job or the position at Stanford. And then if I hadn't gone to Stanford, then the next thing would have happened and so forth. So it's like this chain reaction in which we trace things. And along the same lines, that's how I got the position or got into the Stanford thing where, I was interested in research, and basically my professor at Wisconsin knew a professor at Stanford and he referred me to her. And that was another research position in a similar area. But in this position, I was focused less on front-end development, more building like an end-to-end robotics system. And it was quite an interesting project. It was defined as a multi-robot interaction project where we were studying the interactions of people and chairs and multiple chairs, and also building a multi-robotic system around that. So it was a pretty fun project at the outset. So I was really excited to take the position when I was offered it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so hands-on as well. I think I think that's one of the most exciting things that, I mean, at least sometimes you'll hear the stereotypes of, oh yeah, I'm doing a research project on blah, blah, blah. And it's just like sending out surveys and getting replies from it. And people, I mean, I think like people generalize that to a lot of things. At least I do, which is a terrible habit. So I'm sorry to all the all the proper academics out there. Was that on-site actually? Did you end up living near Stanford?
Yeah, that was another great part of it because it was on site at Stanford, so I was at Stanford for that whole summer, and I also ended up taking a course there, like you mentioned, along with other things, other activities that typically do happen at Stanford. So it was a great experience in the sense of like how you mentioned, right, where people are thinking about where they fit into the world, and one of the things that's very hard to know is like, how do you stack up or rank up against the very best? And for me, going to Stanford was basically about that, was how can I, like, if I compared myself to the very best, how do I rank up essentially? And that I would say was very formative in my experience.
Oh yeah, and I'm pretty sure that's kind of where you felt uncomfortable in terms of like, oh wow, like overwhelmed by how much knowledge and power out there. No, I'm kidding. But no, I'm kidding. For sure, Stanford, like it's not too far from where I live at the moment. I'm in San Francisco, so Stanford, like you definitely do meet people from around here that did go to Stanford, and brilliant minds at the end of the day. And I guess when you're talking about the influence, like at least that's one of the appeal of being in the Bay Area. That's probably one thing that I keep on saying is that, the rate of bumping into people that think like that, then sure, it's higher and you kind of get the influence. I didn't ask this, but where are you based today? Because I feel like that helps a lot with the context.
And certainly, like how you mentioned on the previous thing was, I agree with that. It can be pretty overwhelming when you arrive at a place like the Bay Area or Stanford, where there's lots of crazy people. Like the first train ride I took in the Bay Area, there was some guy solving some esoteric math problems with other people, and this is completely crazy, and you never see this in any other place. So that's an overwhelming aspect. But at the other end of it, you also realize how much of this is hype and prestige and sort of a lot of fluff, and that is a little bit more I don't know, at least motivational, or has been for me, which is that things can look a lot more scary from the outside than they are from the inside. So if people are overwhelmed by some of these places, certainly I would encourage them to not be so demotivated or scared by the prestige, and I would encourage them to actually take a look there. But currently I'm based off of Orange County, Irvine. So that's the current location I'm in. That's where the headquarters for Anduril Industries is based. And it's kind of a funny place to be. But it's sort of like the South Bay in terms of the experience. It's a residential neighborhood. You can travel to Los Angeles, which is kind of like traveling from the South Bay to San Francisco. And yeah, it's mostly, it's literally just Anduril and nothing else here. So it's kind of an oasis.
That totally makes sense. Just seeing different parts of the world, because as you were saying, like you really get to see every bit at least in Wisconsin, even checking out the bit in the Bay Area, and even now today having a little of exposure, a little bit more south of California. That's always fascinating. One of the actually other really interesting point during university life is internships. I feel like research assistant, does that count as internships, or did you actually do any other internships during that time?
Yeah, so when I was at Stanford, I was a research intern, so they do have internships over the summer. So that was kind of what I ended up doing. And I was doing a couple of them at the same time alongside with the course, so I was pretty overwhelmed already. So certainly I didn't do a third internship that summer. However, I did intern at Facebook the next summer, which was also an exciting experience in terms of being at maybe like one of the world's best technology firms with and interfacing with billions of users. So that's the other thing I ended up doing during my university experience.
Like, that's always fun to hear, because everybody has like different, I guess, really good internship experience, and some people will just have like terrible ones or none. So how did that come about? Was it just like a career fair thing where you were just passing by and they actually had a booth set up and they're like, oh yeah, come spend your summer at an internship Facebook? Like, how did that all?
One of the funny things about my experience is that I've never gotten a job through a career fair or an application. So I literally have never gotten a job through applying or through career fair. So even the Facebook job I got through a referral, actually, and that's how I got the indoors.
That's actually so good to hear, because I do know a lot of people get demotivated by it, and at the end of the day, like, yes, it's going to be tough no matter what. Whether it's a career fair, whether you reach out on your own, it's going to be really tough. I've probably sent over like hundreds and hundreds of applications. Till today, I've sent like way, way, way more than I think I should have. But referral is always, I guess, super important, right?
I think all these companies have piles of resumes that's lying around, and no matter how good they advertise their machine learning or AI technology to be, I don't think they have any idea of how to sort through resumes. So they literally have no idea. Like, they're basically lost. And there's a pile of resumes. They don't know who's good or who's decent, who's bad. And really, that's the problem they're facing. And when they get a referral, it's a way to get out of the pile, really. And that's the challenge you're facing at least initially, when you're trying to get a job with these companies. Once you're in, it's quite different. But that's the initial upward battle.
Of course, the game of keywords. I think I probably talked about this before. Game of keywords is where you just throw in as many keywords as you can inside of your CV or resume or whatever it is. But that's for another day of topics. I could dive into that for like another 2 hours into it, and it's just gonna be way more useful at that point. But what is actually cool is, was that on-site as well then? Was the internship at Facebook on-site?
That was another crazy part of being, intern at Facebook, which was like, there's this movie called The Internship where they basically go over the life of Google interns. Yeah, and you hear all these ridiculous stories. I really like the Social Network movie as well. So once I received my job offer, the first thing I rewatched is the Social Network movie and Mark Zuckerberg to get myself hyped. But yeah, you watch all these movies, and actually living through it is pretty wild, especially Facebook, because it's kind of like Disneyland. So it's not necessarily it's not your typical workplace where you go to work. For most industries, like, you have to dress up and wear business casual and then show up at 9 a.m., leave at 5 p.m. and blah, 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 and all that, right? Facebook was more like going to a Disneyland where there's free food, there's literally colorful buildings, there's no rules necessarily, minimal process, and you work with some of the very best people. So it was a pretty wild experience when I was first getting started. So that was a lot of fun.
Even from a perspective of like a university student just going through that, of course you're going to be absorbing a lot of it and just seeing, oh wow, there's this part of the world, the industry that kind of looks like that. And if I'm not mistaken, the Facebook headquarters, that's based in Palo Alto?
Close. It's in Menlo Park. One of their buildings is, I think, actually a historic building. The Sun Microsystems, one of the legendary software company, and that's more of it looks like it's quite colorful. They have like fairs there, so there's like actually intern fairs where they have like games and so forth. So they literally do dress that part of as Disneyland. But then there's also a larger building right across the street from it, which is where Mark Zuckerberg sits, and some of the newer offices are based off of.
Yeah, that's so fun to hear because, I mean, obviously Menlo Park, the area, I think very close to Apple Park as well, and all the Google stuff and everything. So they're all over there. And then, as you were saying, like even just spending the summer in the Bay Area, just being check out, oh, wow, this technology exists. These kind of people exist. Like that must be transformative in terms of how you just tackle problems in the long run. So, one thing that might actually be helpful for, I guess, like just anybody listening is, what was, I guess, the technology that you were working with during your internship? Like, what was I mean, obviously you have like a project assigned kind of thing, but what did that look like?
Yeah, I guess I was working on the newsfeed integrity team. So it's a newsfeed product. Obviously, it's a product that I think pretty much everybody is familiar with. It's used by billions of people. And my focus was more on building ranking algorithms for that product. And yeah, it was a lot of data science ML work where you have models, you have ranking algorithms, and you're analyzing data. There's a lot of SQL related things where you're building queries, you're building dashboards, and so forth. That was a huge chunk of that internship, and the newsfeed integrity's goal is to improve the integrity of the newsfeed, which is reduce harmful data, reduce bias, and so forth, and basically build a more trustworthy experience for the Facebook's user base. So that was more on the data science side. I also did some product work in terms of building some features for the product. I built a a mapping system for mapping articles to some context. So you would, if you see an article on your newsfeed, you would click on it and get some background information. What is this article about? Maybe provide some information about the publisher and so forth. And most of it leveraged, like I already mentioned, SQL, which was query language for databases. And leverage most of the Facebook tools internally. They have a tool for machine learning called FB Learner Flow, which is what we use for the models. And on the product side, it was a lot of PHP essentially, which is or hack, which is and the name is not a misnomer there. It's literally a hack. So that was also fun.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of Hack actually. That is their own proprietary. I think they built it on top of PHP or something like that. I definitely know they have
the hack PHP. It's a hack.
Yeah,
it's a hack for PHP. So at least they're being honest about it.
Yeah, I know, and at least they're not going to mistake it for anything else.
Exactly.
That's great. Knowing that, yes, even the internal tools, like they could leverage it, and like you already having a lot of, I guess, hands-on experience with SQL. Like a lot of people don't get, too much of that during university. Like, yeah, you learn about it in computer science classes, database classes, but in terms of actually being hand-on and you're probably getting exposed into millions and millions and millions of data and entries, that is obviously so much more useful because it's very practical. And then you end up getting some results. And then, as you're saying, if you're going to use that to improve certain ML models, then, it's definitely the putting it in practice part as opposed to just like all theory at the end of the day. So
Yeah, absolutely. And Facebook certainly has, one of the best data sets in the whole world. So being able to run SQL on that is really fascinating because you can really the applications are endless.
And yeah, I think that's the lesser spoken side of Facebook is that not only do they do that bit, but when we talk about Hack, when we talk about React, when we talk about all these like actual tech heavy projects, that it's not going to affect any, I guess, daily user on Facebook. Like they don't care about how React is built, right? But they have a very high group of people that maintain all these projects that are tools for other developers, and like that's the lesser spoken side. But I mean, I think that's going to be a big thing to dive into. Like I'm pretty sure this is a common thing where they offer not residents, but they basically have like somewhere for you to live right during the summer when you go there for an internship.
They cover pretty much your housing, your food, your transportation, and so forth. They even reimburse, certain things like Lyft sometimes if you're going to an event or something. So it's pretty comprehensive in terms of compensation and all that.
Yeah, and obviously that's gonna make your life a bit easier, and the whole transition of like focusing on actually being great at whatever you're working on. I think that's appealing. So hey, obviously anybody out there who's putting out there, put the effort, try to get yourself an internship in a university because I think it's gonna be super beneficial for everybody at the end of the day. But yeah, like I feel like we talk about so much about just the background and the academic, and that really helps you with what you do today. What was the transition like? How do we got to Anduril today? Basically, like big congrats, you graduated there. And you did all these amazing internship and everything. How did you make the next jump then?
I guess the main way I was thinking about it was I already had a job offer from Facebook and I had a safe job from a big tech company. And that was sort of like something I could put at the back of my head saying, hey, whatever happens, I have this and I think it's going to be fine in the worst case. So that was the starting point. And then my goal was, okay, what can I do or how can I do better? What are the ways in which I can, increase my impact even more? And again, going back to sort of my real passion for startups, I wanted to really, see how it is in a fast growing startup and a high impact startup and rather finding, or working for a startup. And that was sort of the starting point. And I followed this venture capital firm called Founders Fund. I'm a big fan of them. They were the first investors in Facebook already, so I knew some of their work, or I was familiar with some of the outputs they produce. They're also key investors in other top startups like Stripe, Palantir, Lyft, and Oculus, and the list goes on and on. So I knew that whenever they invest in a company, at least their philosophy is that when they make an investment, they make a high conviction investment. They make a concentrated investment, meaning that their bets are much likelier to pay off than some of the other venture capital firms, which are a lot more spray and pray approach. So when I knew that a company is backed by Founders Fund, you can be sort of confident that, or with at least higher confidence that it's going to do well. And so I was tracking Founders Fund, and one of the companies they made investment was this company called Anduril, which had a really amazing founding team. It was Palmer Luckey, who had built Oculus and so did Facebook. Was Brian Schimpf, who was director of engineering in Palantir, and Trey Stephens, who's a partner at Founders Fund. So when I saw that kind of founding team being backed by Founders Fund, I just knew that it's going to be a really, really successful company. And knowing all of that, I applied to Anduril, and yeah, that's how I got my step into the door.
Yeah, the level of DD, the level of due diligence we even jumped into, that is actually phenomenal because you made connections, right? In terms of not actual like human connections, but in terms of like, oh, just because you have these different parts, these different points, and then you're able to link them together and kind of realize that, hey, look, this is brewing and this is going to be a great adventure going from there. That is so great to hear that. I mean, till today, that's probably what you're living at the moment. So now that we got a bit of context in terms of like, what did you apply for and what do you do? I guess what's your role today, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. I also did like how you mentioned that it was a lot about connecting the dots. And I think that's a key pattern for how you build startups. So when I analyze why Anduril is successful, it's because they connected all these pieces in a way that really made sense and were really powerful. So they were able to form this really exceptional team, but they were also connecting the dots on the technological side. So they were leveraging off new incoming technologies like IoT. So NVIDIA was really launching their IoT platforms for edge compute really recently, only in 2017. They were also leveraging sort of the newfound interest in defense technology and so forth. So it was really about connecting all these pieces. And that's I think a key pattern that one must keep in mind when you're building a startup. And in terms of the things I work on right now, my main focus is actually platform infrastructure. And I think you mentioned previously where one of the underrated aspects of Facebook is actually most of the tools you use is internally built. And that enables like really fast, rapid developer velocity. I remember working at Facebook, I didn't have to do any kind of setup. My laptop was fully set up. It had all the tools. I didn't have to install any software. I didn't have to compile any software. Everything was in the cloud. You would just open up your IDE. They have a custom IDE. Inside the custom IDE, you can write your code. Once the code is done, you compile it, it's sent to the cloud, and it's automatically deployed and so forth. So that's the real secret sauce, I think, behind these really successful tech companies is that they build very high quality infrastructure. And along the same lines, my current focus is pretty much to do the same, is to build that kind of infrastructure that will rapidly accelerate developer velocity.
Yeah, and I could definitely say developers are the harshest critic out there.
Absolutely.
As many times you want to say that customers are harsh out there. Yes, of course, customers are harsh. They're the one that fills your vaults at the end of the day. But appealing to developers and engineers out there, man, I can imagine the absolute hurdles you got to go through to satisfy those needs.
Certainly, one of the skills I've had to develop is going through some of those hurdles, because engineers are very opinionated about things, about ways of doing things, about what is the better tool. And certainly the programming language wars is case in point in this. So there's certainly a key part of my strategic repertoire is how to deal with these things. And that's been my focus, so forth. On the other hand, I would also say that a lot of my focus recently has been on sort of defining products and sort of going through the design and architecture of them. I lead our work around simulation infrastructure, and one of the things I've learned is that certainly they're software engineers, but they're also normal people at the end of the day. So general product thinking continues to apply.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. We're all human at the end of the day. And in terms of putting a lot of color into all this, this is great because Anduril, in terms of the requirement to actually be able to build all these software and all these infrastructure that supports it, I'm pretty sure it's very, very expansive. One thing that I personally just don't know is what is the product of Anduril? Because we mentioned a couple of times, yes, we're building these infrastructure for people to dev on everything. What is it? What exactly is the product? Is it a hardware product? Is it a software product? Is it both? Help me out here, because I'm definitely, I'm obviously loving to know more about it.
I guess Anduril is a defense company that builds both hardware and software products. So we have, our product line includes something called the Sentry Tower, which is a tower. It's solar powered. You can place it in locations. It has various sensors on top of it, like radar, electro-optical, which is camera, and so forth. And it does edge sensor fusion, and you can which basically means detect targets and track them. That is one product. The other product we have is something called the Ghost, which I've been working on pretty closely for a while. But essentially, what that does is, again, it's a drone. It's a portable drone, and you can sort of pack it up in a case. It's modular. You can put various different kinds of payload on it, and it comes with lots of autonomy algorithms, which is another area I've focused on quite a bit. And also our Lattice platform, which is the core software backbone.
Yeah, my goodness, just because I love hearing about this world of hardware and software as you start listing them, because when you talk about a lot of the tech companies out there, some of them are purely software. So it's straight up just web interfaces or backend programs that kind of run, and then it kind of makes all the stuff together. But then very rare that you get a very fascinating, you have self-driving cars and everything, sure. But when you talk about physical infrastructures of towers that you're building, and then you have these drones that you're building as well, your background though, how did that help you not be afraid of jumping into something like this? Because somebody that comes from, I guess, a software engineering background, they'll be oh, what code do you write? What language do you write to put this all together? So I guess how is it linked together? Is it written in a specific language? The hardware, is it specific? Did you guys have to build your own, I guess, boards to actually be able to function all this? How does that whole thing work? These are all the questions I got in my head right now.
I'm not sure I can comment on the specifics of how Anduril does stuff, but in the general case, it is part of this broader, let's say, wave of sensors. I think it was even Eric Schmidt who's pitching okay, what is the next big thing? It's going to be sensors, because you're going to have an explosion in sensors, and everything's going to have sensors soon enough. So it is part of that wave where you have this IoT or sensor explosion. And there are other companies that have focused on IoT and sensors, like Samsara, which integrates sensors for logistics, or even Google, Microsoft. These companies also have IoT platforms. So that's the broader wave, I think, where you can sort of think about, and self-driving cars are also part of this wave, where you have a car that has, an internet connection in it. It has a computer. You ride a Tesla, and you understand what this means. So that's how I think about it in a broad sense. And certainly we can dive a lot more into details of how these IoT platforms or systems are built.
I mean, that's all super great to hear, because I know, at least in the back of my head, is that when I use technology, so for example, if I'm building a project and I have to use React or whatever, like that translates quite easily, obviously on a screen. But then when it trying to translate to hardware, like God knows how the gear shifts inside a car is going to react to that, right? So that's always fascinating. And I guess the technologies that you still use nowadays, like you're building a lot of like infrastructure, but also other different parts of it. Is it still mostly JavaScript based, or is there other technologies like Go, Rust, Java that you touch quite often?
I guess one of the interesting things about Anduril is that I like to say that we have everything but blockchain. So we really do have a full variety of things, ranging from perception, machine learning, front end, back end, hardware, sensors, and literally anything you can think of in the software space. We basically have. We have autonomy as well. So that basically means that we have a broad variety of technologies. And in terms of my own experience, I've had the privilege to work on almost all of these aspects. So I've touched front-end infrastructure, which is React-based, done a lot of back-end work, which is Go-based and C++-based. I've done some autonomy work, which is also C++-based, perception work, which is C++-based, hardware work, which is NVIDIA Tegra-based, Linux-based. So there's I've personally been able to work with pretty much the entire spectrum. I also did machine learning in the beginning. So I literally did everything at Anduril. So there's a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, because I think like even the many engineers I've gotten the absolute pleasure to talk to over the years is that this like there's no fear of learning new languages. There's no fear of learning new tooling, just because that's how the world is. You can't have everything written in a single C++ language, for example. Like you need this combination of different, framework languages, and the idea of being agnostic to all of them. I feel like that's quite prominent, and I'm actually really glad that you're able to, see all sides of it. Even Linux, like being able to touch a lot of that stuff, and like writing probably a lot of Bash in there as well. That is, I mean, at least for a personal developer, experience and growth, that is definitely part of your journey. So super fun to hear about that.
No, I completely agree. I think you already mentioned in the past where certainly, that's how you got your first gig, was self-learning Meteor.js, and it was similar for me. And being a software engineer really means you have to be an autodidact, which is a self-learner. And if you're not able to do that, then it can be a pretty tricky job to be. The other thing I would say though is that one of the things that helps, for example, learn people programming languages is that there really are a few core concepts that are very generally applicable across all of them. For example, you can learn about static versus dynamic typing. That's already like a huge enough concept that applies to pretty much every language, and it gives you a good understanding of how these languages operate. And then there's also other aspects like memory models and how you think about those. So once you get those core ideas, which you can really get from programming language classes at universities, once you grok those 4 core concepts, picking up the new syntax is not that hard. So I would say that's the key. And finally, when you're sort of building a startup, I would encourage people to, on the one hand, not force everybody to use JavaScript for literally everything, which people do, and it can be quite problematic. But on the other hand, I would also encourage people to not have 20 different languages and have every developer write their software in their own favorite language, because that will really reduce the velocity of your organization, and it will really hamper the ability of engineers to collaborate with each other. And so I would pick a happy medium of a few 3 or 4 core languages, which solve really big problems in your organization, and stick with those and force everybody to use those. That would be the advice.
That's great, because when you're seeing on a high level of understanding the concepts, definitely put your attention to that. Whoever's studying computer science, whoever's working in computer sciences, whatever, even the data model behind a lot of this stuff and understanding. This is where we get into a bit of like the architecture design, right? Like, why are we modeling it this way? How does that go? That has a much bigger impact compared to like how the for loops are syntactically different between all the different language. Like, sure, you can write for loops 60 million different ways. It's kind of doing the same, but when we're talking about like the actual, like the dynamic typing, even like object oriented, depending if you require that kind of stuff, that's way more important. At least in my opinion. Some people might agree, disagree, but that's the fun part about these conversations because a lot of people talk about it. um, the other thing that was actually, I think I'm still have a cloud over my head in terms of like when we talk about software infrastructure specifically. So you really get the chance to build a lot of it. What is included into that? Is that just like when we're talking about, for example, the tooling, the developer experience? A lot of these other keywords that pop into my head is like the CI/CD flow. The I guess you were saying the internal tools to do X, Y, and Z. Like, what does that look like from your perspective nowadays? What is software infrastructure? Because I know a lot of people have different definitions for it.
One quote I like to use when I think about this is this line from Sir Isaac Newton, where he basically says something like, "If I've seen farther, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And I think software infrastructure is essentially something like those shoulders or the giants on which you have to stand, or it's kind of like a platform on which you can sort of stand and build better applications. We already like mentioned or alluded to this, where when I was working at Facebook, I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. I just had all this infrastructure at my behest that I could just apply and be more effective. And in a similar sense, I think software infrastructure is basically software that you write that makes it cheaper for other developers to solve hard problems or build their own applications. So it's really, you could think of it as software for other software engineers. And that sort of creates this compounding or platform effect that can be really really huge step change in the quality of outputs of an organization.
I like that definition of it because, I mean, first of all, thank you. Thanks to all the people who build tools for developers, whether it's open source or within a company kind of thing. Those are definitely useful. And how do you, what I'm trying to figure out is how do you know what to build? Because I know like most of the time when in a daily, like, okay, I'm doing software engineering, I'm writing code and all of that, there are recurring stuff that comes up and I complain a lot about. And then you try to hope that there's a solution out there. Is that the approach that you've taken in terms of knowing what to build, or is there like another way to tackle this?
Yeah, that's a good question, and certainly this is like a topic in itself. You could focus on this for hours, but I've been thinking about this a lot recently as a technical lead type person at Anduril, because my job is precisely to do what you just said, which is find the highest value areas that developers are struggling with, find their actual needs, and sort of try to satisfy them. The framework I like to use, I'm sure you're familiar, or others might be familiar with this person called Clayton Christensen. He likes to use this concept called jobs to be done. And it's essentially like the idea is, when you're thinking about what are the needs of a customer, you try to think of it in terms of what are the jobs they need to get done. So as an example, the example Clayton Christensen provides is he's sort of analyzing, or he's been hired to analyze McDonald's. He's been hired to increase their revenue for their product line. And he's looking at their milkshakes, and he's trying to figure out, okay, what is the need the milkshake has? And he basically analyzes it and finds out that milkshake, or people are buying milkshake only in the mornings as they go to work. It's kind of peculiar. It's a milkshake. Why are they doing that? And when he digs more, he finds out that the job that the milkshake does for them is it helps fill their bellies while on being a commute. And it's fairly cheap, and you can drink it while you're driving. So it's solving a job of the customer that they want to fill their bellies before they reach work. So that is the kind of framework I've been trying to develop in terms of understanding what are the various jobs that need to get done, at least on a high level. And then you can obviously drill down into, okay, how do you categorize these jobs? Which are the high value jobs? Which are the unmet jobs, and so forth?
Yeah, that's so fascinating because, there's always a job that needs to be done. Do you have any, like, I guess, concrete examples of people, like, not complaining about it? I guess, like, engineers complain about. Like, do you have any, I guess, just recent ones? Not even recent ones, but some of that you've seen across your career of very common engineers' complaint points?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there's certainly maybe two categories here. One is that engineers have complaints, but on the other end, it's also more positive. So there's negative and positive improvements. Negative is that people have complaints and you want to provide them a tooling that solves their complaints. And then there's positive, which is that they might not have complaints, but things would be a lot better. And both of those are important and not necessarily, and not necessarily mutually exclusive, but you can broadly think of developer needs in those two categories. In terms of examples, on the complaint side, one of the things I personally experienced is a lot around build, getting your stuff built, getting it tested, and so forth. That is a huge headache. Some languages have that very, very easy. So in Go, it just all works out of the box. You don't think about anything. But in C++, it's basically a nightmare, and there's no standard tool for it. And part of my one of the things I did end up doing, focusing on a lot, is improving our C++ build infrastructure. That's on the more negative side. On the positive side, a lot of what you can do when you're building platform infrastructure is really think about what will allow an application or an application developer to test their software faster. One example is when you're building front ends, you really have all these workflows, and the workflows need to have various data streams that support them in the back end. So you can build a lot of automated backend tooling that can enable automated testing of the front end, and this can improve the iteration cycles that front end developers have. Those are two examples of software infrastructure pains.
Those are definitely relatable for people that are, I guess, currently working in software engineering, because the amount of times that, whether you want to put it on staging before prod, or even like, oh, you just want to release like whatever blue-green deploys, like, yo, you just want to put 5% of the views on the new one. Like, those are hard problems to solve, but it improves like developers' life at the end of the day. So, and then when you're talking about velocity, being able to see your changes like deployed with the proper integrations, with the proper like API calls outside, like those are really hard to deal with. And yeah, I'm glad that, you get to look into all of that, whether it's like a reactive response in terms of people complaining about it, or like an active, well, what if we do this? It's going to be better for everybody. So, one of the most fascinating tools that I do want to mention, I don't know if you actually do build anything similar, is like, all the prettiers and all the formatting, the code formatting ones. Somehow it seems so simple, but they managed to find a way to make it super useful for devs. So that's something I just wanted to throw in there for in terms of dev tools that help people. One of the words that actually gets thrown around a little bit, I don't know if you would consider it as part of software infrastructure, but the word tech debt, like, does that fit anywhere in this whole thing, or is it just a fancy word that I threw out that is not completely related to software infrastructure?
Yeah, I think there's certainly one coupling or one way in which it is related. So certainly every organization accumulates tech debt. And one of the things I think about a lot when we are architecting systems is that if you're a fast growing company, you're going to have tech debt. And then the question is not how to find ways to pay back that tech debt, but rather how you can make the debt that's accumulated to be relatively cheap. And what I mean by that is essentially, or at least how that translates into architecture or infrastructure, is that when you're building infrastructure, you want the components of the infrastructure to be loosely coupled. So for example, if you're building some sort of, let's work with the formatting tool that you mentioned. Let's say I want to build a better formatting tool, and maybe that's going to be high value, maybe it won't be. I don't know. It's hard to know because the company is growing so fast, it's so many changing variables. But the worst thing I can do there is make the formatting tool tightly coupled with everything else. So let's say I build another deployment system that's somehow really dependent on this formatting tool. And if the formatting tool changes or is crappy, that basically means that everything else doesn't work anymore. That is a bad design. Rather, what you want is you want to build a formatting tool in a way that is loosely coupled with the rest of the system, where, okay, if the formatting tool you later on realize is crappy and is not good and you want to throw it away, you should be able to do that in a cheap manner without affecting the rest of the system. So I would say that's how at least I think about tech debt in fast-growing companies like startups.
That is, I think that is more useful, I guess, even for myself, just hearing about that, because everybody talks about tech debt in terms of how you tackle it, how you minimize it, how you quantify it. Like, everybody wants to solve it, and as you were saying, like, you can't really run away from it. It just exists wherever you live. The word startup, the word in terms of, because, like, my whole career, I've worked in startups, well, mostly startups. That is completely different beast than obviously the big corps, the big ones that are already established. So this environment of tension and hypergrowth and uncertainness and all that. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I feel like this is definitely the best place to do it. And then and even if we talk about the engineering process behind a startup, because startups obviously have multiple parts. You got to be able to have a product, have the engineering side, have the marketing side, have the business side, and all of it. Let's put into perspective a bit. Like, what would you consider, I guess, a startup? Because what you described before, like you were employee 47, now it's like 500 plus. Like, how would you describe a startup?
No, I think I think you hit the point or the key of the definition already, which is you mentioned that it was 47 employees 2 years ago. Now it's more than 500 employees. So I think a startup is pretty much a company that is designed to grow fast. And essentially, that is the key or the crux of a startup. And the only sort of ammunition you have in this process is momentum. And you kind of have to rely on letting the momentum flow into itself and keep compounding that way. So at least that's one metaphor or definition I use for startups. The other aspect of this is I think of startups as kind of like telling a story, because certainly you have this rapid growth aspect, but it's also coupled with, starting from nothing. I mean, there was literally nothing there a few years ago, and now you have something. And the way you make that happen is by thinking about startups as a story or a film that you're producing. And each stage is kind of like you reveal more of the story. And there's going to be a finale, there's a genesis, and I guess I'm currently in the middle of the story at Anduril, and I don't yet know how it's going to end, but hopefully it's a wild ride.
Yeah, even throwing the word Genesis out there, I absolutely love it, because I feel like a lot of people that are part of the startup world, that's always something that comes up once in a while. The story's never uncertain, it's never fully written, and when you were mentioning even just hypergrowth, like, yeah, sure, you'll have startups that all of them do strive for the hypergrowth, but obviously it doesn't always end up happening that way. So hearing it from your perspective of actually being part of this hypergrowing phase, fortunately, I think we, like at the company I work at currently, Notable, we are in that phase as well. So it's, so many faces that you see popping around everywhere. It's like, oh, wow, like, is this actually happening? And we're not only talking about engineer faces. Like, of course, you'll have new engineers coming on, but it's literally any part of the business. So as I was saying, like sales, more product, more customer facing, like they all come together at the same time. And that's kind of where, I guess this addiction for people in the startup world. Is that, would you agree that people in startups, they like it for this reason, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely addicting, and I think that's critical though when you're a startup founder and thinking about, okay, how do I be successful? If you don't have that growth story, things can fall apart pretty quickly. And the reason for this is there's all these feedback loops that are built in. So when you announce a round, everybody hears about it, everybody's hyped, and it's not just sort of future engineers hearing about the story. It's like you mentioned, like business people, product people, marketing people, operations people, they're hearing about it. But then also future VCs are hearing about it, future financiers are hearing about it, your customers are hearing about it. And then once they hear about the positive news or the momentum, they are further motivated to either join your company as employees or be a customer or be your investor and so forth. And once that happens, again, it compounds back into itself. So it's kind of this feedback loop that is really critical to these startups. And once you don't have that, I know you say it's an addiction, and maybe that's a slightly negative aspect to it, but it's also, for better or for worse, the lifeblood of these startups, where if you don't have that, then let's say, okay, you had a down round. Now everybody thinks, engineers don't want to join your company, investors don't want to invest in you, customers are not confident in you. And once you don't have any of those pieces, then again, like your future seems a lot more precarious than it would have if you had that growth story instead. So there's two sides of the coin, I guess.
Of course. And obviously I didn't want to put it in a bad light. Like when I mean addiction, I think it's just like this, when you're trying to push boundaries and when you're trying to, may see what is possible, what is like not defined yet, what is out there. I feel like that's probably just the way I was looking at the startup world, is that the drive behind people trying to survive and really push what is possible, what can improve people's life in ways that nobody has ever thought of. Like that's probably my experience, at least in the past couple of years, is when you work for startups, that is definitely one of the mindset that you have behind it. But definitely no way, in a negative way, that startups out there are, I guess, like addiction wise. It's just like this interest, this passion, this push to it. It's definitely way more prominent, at least in the startup world.
There's certainly one aspect of it where it's just like over hype, like everything gets hyped and then it gets crazed, and then you have this mimetic madness or something around them, and everybody's like going crazy. So I've certainly felt that, and in some industries it's really, really heightened. Like if you're in crypto, I mean, it's just really, really out of control sometimes. So I definitely agree with not necessarily being a pure positive, but also, like you mentioned, that's how people are motivated to push the boundary.
If I had to put a nice sentence to it, is that you have these very established corporate companies, so the big ones, the FANGs and all that, but in the startup world, I guess, like, the highs are very high and the lows are very low. It just swings very, very quickly. And then even when you're talking about like funding rounds, for example, like you don't really talk about that with the bigger corporates, because they don't really they need funding, but they don't need funding rounds and like these like different routes of VCs or whether angels or whatever you need to do it. For them, most of them are probably trading, publicly, and they can have some way of funding to that. But when we're talking about startups and they need to keep up with this momentum, these funding rounds definitely have a big impact into it. And I guess for people who are not familiar exactly with funding rounds, it's basically if, for example, if a startup needs capital to keep on running. So very, very common, a startup is not profitable. So every month they're going through a good amount of money. At some point, you'll run out of it. So that's kind of the idea between these funding rounds. And in the startup world, I feel like a lot of people that work in the startup world talk about that way more than, I guess, people in, the corporate world. Is that fair to say, or?
No, I think that makes complete sense because, certainly these startups don't really have any, they do have revenue, but it's not at all sufficient for them in terms of even financing maybe the engineering salaries and so forth. So they are a lot more dependent on equity financing from VCs. So it completely makes sense that a lot of the day-to-day or even month to month is driven by the financing rounds, and those are kind of they act as milestones almost in a way that big companies, maybe they have quarterly reviews, but they probably have different kind of milestones like users or something like that, and it's less of a focus on the venture capital financing.
And I actually do like when you mentioned like having the consideration for even like engineering salaries. Like that's part of the whole engineering process bit where if we kind of put a magnifying glass, so yes, the startup world, like obviously it involves engineering, all the other teams as well. But if we put a little bit of magnifying glass of an engineering team, in the startup world, yes, number one, consideration, like, okay, how much can we pay engineers? The other bit that I actually do want to get your take on is that since you're growing so quickly, what is like, I guess, the onboarding process? Like what's the way of being able to welcome so many engineers, I guess, more seamlessly? It's a very general question, but you could definitely add a bit of a color to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly I'm closely working with a lot of the engineering processes at my company. So it's been one of my core focuses. So I certainly do have some thoughts here, and definitely a little bit of work in progress because there's a lot to do here. I think one pattern I found the most useful in onboarding new engineers is you can even sort of model your whole engineering team out. So there's almost like this state machine you can think of where you start off as a new hire, then you're being mentored by an engineer, and almost like your goal in that mentoring is to make that engineer prepared to mentor a future engineer. So it's kind of like this process in which you think about growing your organization. And once you have that built in, then you have a machine that can sort of mentor future engineers who will in turn mentor future engineers and so forth. And then when it comes to mentoring like a particular engineer, I think the most valuable thing has been closely working with a highly connected engineer. So let's say there's some people who work just basically in some silos, working on some deep project that doesn't necessarily interface with too many teams. Those are not necessarily the best mentors. Best mentors can be those who have are a lot more cross-functional, who know pretty much everybody at the company, or lots of people at the company, who know other teams, who work often with other teams. And the best way to onboard a new person, I found, is to just work with this highly connected engineer in a very tight capacity for a sprint or two. And by doing that, you can basically learn how the company operates, all the tools, all the processes, and so forth. And and also, of course, to be able to become that future mentor for future engineers.
Yeah, I think if you lay it out that clearly in terms of like, all right, everything I could teach you, like I expect you to be able to teach it to somebody else. That's a good way of approaching it. That's kind of how knowledge gets passed on. And obviously you want all that documented at the end of the day. So that's probably going to be super, super important during the onboarding process to have great documentation so that everybody could improve, contribute, nearly be automated if ever that needs to be. So, and one thing that I do appreciate is pair programming. When we're talking about somebody working very closely with somebody else, the concept of pair programming is very, very common through the industry, through the software engineering industry at least, where that's basically it. You get to share the the coding experience with multiple people together. So I'm glad that you did put an emphasis on that.
I think you can also think about sort of your organization in a similar way as if it's a system. So the organization is basically a machine, and it's not that different. Well, certainly you can't program, like you don't have maybe in the future you have an AI army and you'll just be writing code to program all your laborers. But today you can't program the laborers, but it is still a machine. And the job of the machine is to produce more software or produce more tools, products, technologies that will propel the business. And there's this concept or this book called Team Topologies that even argues that you should think about your team literally as if you're designing APIs or system architecture, you should define the boundaries between various parts of your team, and you should think about, okay, what is the interface? Like, how does your engineering team interface with the product team? And think about that interface. Who's the person who's interfacing? And so forth. So yeah, I would say, and the onboarding process is pretty much like this, where you want to sort of build that feature into your machine of being able to onboard future engineers. And one of the cool or core things I think about when designing infrastructure is that it should be self-serve. So certainly onboarding ideally is self-serve. The engineers, they come in, they have a document, and they basically know just by seeing that document what are the next steps and how they can be onboarded. So building a self-serve machine that produces new engineers is part of how I think about engineering processes and onboarding as well.
Absolutely love that, because that's just how, I guess, evolution happens. Basically, you just learn whatever you know previously and you get to add on top of it, whether you're self-serve or somebody else helping. Being able to do that at any time, any context, that's just better for the bigger picture at the end. And then when you were mentioning engineering teams, like depending on, I guess, at least in the engineering world, you get probably like 4 to 6 maybe engineers on a team at the same time. And then you have like these peripherals of like products, and then you have product designers, and then you have like program managers, if you want to throw that in there, like so many different parties. I'm guessing that's similar to what you guys have, right? In terms of, I guess, during this whole growing phase.
Yeah, I would say that's about the right team size. There are some companies, and I am pretty... I like this philosophy of having a super horizontal organization. So when I was at Facebook, for example, I think I was like 3 levels below Zuck as an intern or something like that, which was pretty crazy given the size of the company. But I think the benefit of that is you have less verticality, and the amount of verticality in your organization is negatively correlated to the speed of your organization. So if it's a super vertical organization, like maybe IBM is like that, where you have 20 levels or something, and you don't know how deep the rabbit hole goes. So that's a really slow organization. On the other hand, what I saw at Facebook, for example, was really, really fast. I mean, they did take their motto. Maybe the braking part wasn't great, but they did move fast. So they did move fast and break things. So I think that's a pretty important aspect, especially in building startups, going back to how, the only thing you have momentum and the growth and how the feedback loops build into each other. Having the velocity is really important. So certainly the median team size can be around 4 to 6, and that's the Amazon 2 pizza box team size. But I would personally experiment with even larger teams and flatter organizations and more autonomous engineers.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having teams with less engineers than that, like 2 engineers or teams with like 10 engineers. Like those definitely do exist. It obviously depends on the feature, the context, but yeah, it's always fun stuff that people that, work in those kind of contexts, those kind of environment. We kind of talk about it very, very often anyway. So good to hear, people share the experience. Yeah, I think like for the people that are, I guess, still like in university or like trying to get into this proper software engineering world, like what kind of advice do you have for them? This is really generic, of course, but like I know a lot of people that do sometimes listen to this, or even they're like in the first year or second year of working as a software engineer. If they want to keep on, enjoying the whole journey, what kind of general advice do you have for people in that position?
General advice is usually difficult because if it was correct, then everybody would apply it and they maybe would not be that good or something like that, because best advice is more specifically tailored, so you can actually use it or something. So along the same lines, I would, if there was a general advice, I would still say just go to a big tech company. They have a lot more process or structure around it. But if your goal is to be in startups, then I would recommend startups. One ranking I have, or I give to people, is that number 1 is a fast growing startup that has like top venture capital backing. Usually you will do better in almost any way, like in terms of learning or financially and so forth. Second is big tech, like FANG. And third is startup that's not working. So I would not, that's the ranking, and I would go with that. There are various resources on finding fast growing startups. For example, Wealthfront publishes, I think it's the fast growing startups list or something like that, where you can just look it up and you can join one of those. Or career launching companies, that's what they call it. Wealthfront career launching companies. And yeah, joining one of those is probably better than FANG. And if you can't join one of those, just join FANG. And those are the 1 and 2. And I would not recommend joining a startup that's not working, because that would be pretty bad for your career.
I mean, some people are sadistic out there, so you never know.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, in terms of when you're saying like generic advice, that is a great advice. Like it could apply to so many different things. So I really just want to thank you for that. And even just in general, thank you for being on the show to begin with, because I got the absolute pleasure to pick at your brain and all the good stories that you got. Where can people find you? Social media, any kind of stuff going on?
Yeah, you can find me on my website or my Twitter. My website is spelled abhayvenkatesh.com. Yeah, abhayvenkatesh.com, and you can find me there. And it also links me to my Twitter, so hopefully we can stay in touch there.
Amazing. And of course, I'll link all of it, like Twitter, your website, LinkedIn, even if you want to. So definitely going to be available, that information down there. And yeah, just once again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Perry. Hopefully we didn't ruin your podcast too much.
That's the purpose, and we've definitely done that.
Or maybe we didn't ruin it. Hopefully we ruined it a lot. And,
yeah, exactly. All right, then. Thanks again, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.
Thanks, Perry.